in person or joining us virtually, welcome to our seminar. I am Camille Taylor, Head of Corporate Communications, and it is my pleasure to have you here with us, whether it's this afternoon or this evening, depending on whichever part of the world you're joining us from. Immediately, I would like to introduce the members of our panel for this seminar. Starting on my immediate right, and ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to acknowledge the arrival of the Premier of the Turks and Caicos Islands and Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Caribbean Development Bank, Mr. Charles, or should I say the Honorable, sir, the Honorable Charles Washington Missick.
Governor, I want to make sure he probably understands the recovery duration adjustment so he can sell it to the FCDO.
And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Governor of the Turks and Caicos Islands. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll introduce the panel to start the proceedings. On my immediate right, we have Professor Eric Strobe from the Department of Economics and the Oschenja Center for Climate Change Research, University of Bern, Switzerland. To his right, we have Ambassador Aubrey Webson, Chair of the Alliance of Small Island States and Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the United Nations. We have Mr. Ian Durant, Director of Economics at the Caribbean Development Bank, and he will serve as our moderator. Mr. Jason Cotton, economist with the CDB. And Dr. Keith Nurse, the principal of the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College and member of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. Our seminar this afternoon is entitled Measuring Vulnerability and Resilience for Small States, the Recovery Duration Adjuster. Now, the RDA, as we call it, is a framework which the CDB is developing as a mechanism for ensuring that small developing states, like many of the countries in the Caribbean, can access financing on the terms that consider the challenges we face from external shocks, which can be anything from a Category 5 hurricane to volatile oil prices. The CDB introduced this framework at the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, in the United Kingdom last year. And since then, we've been refining our formulas and developing our methodology. Our proposition is for the RDA to be adopted as a global standard for vulnerability and resilience measurement. And today, we will demonstrate the merits of our proposal. To begin this discussion, we'll have a video presentation. But I'd like to say to our audience at home and online, the discussion might get a little technical. The terminology might be sometimes a little bit complicated. Some big words might be in there, some formulas that look a little bit like hieroglyphics. But please understand that behind all of this is a tireless effort to create the best future possible for the people of the Caribbean and other small states. So stay with us throughout the discussion, and it promises to be informative and lively. We're going to start with a video that will set the context and just break down some of the concepts behind the RDA and some of the reasoning why we want to have this framework adopted. After that, our primary presenter, Mr. Jason Cotton, will give a full overview from start to finish of this framework. Then we'll hand it over to our able moderator, Mr. Ian Durant, and he will coordinate the panel discussion on the issue. Then it's back over to you, our audience, online and in person, and we're going to have a Q&A. And we plan to have a very lively discussion. Now, let me just set one parameter. We have our audience that is online. We have our audience that is in the house. And this discussion is scheduled to go until 5 o'clock. If the Q&A in-house gets rigorous and the debate gets going and we want to continue, we'll just sign off for our virtual audience and we can keep going in the space. But we just have to be mindful that we're operating in two spheres. But there doesn't have to be any limit to the conversation that we have here. So without saying anything more, we'll give the video presentation and then we'll get right into the discussion. Thank you.
Vibrant but vulnerable at the same time, the Caribbean faces a unique challenge on the global stage. As small coastal states, the countries of the region are extremely exposed to the effects of external shocks such as natural disasters, economic crises, and pandemics. And the impact of such shocks lingers on for far longer than it would in a larger country with more resources and a more diversified economy. The devastation wrought by an experience such as a catastrophic storm can wipe out decades of economic progress in hours, and recovery can be a long way off. This is the everyday lived reality for the people of the Caribbean, and for some, it is a reality they have personally lived through.
During Maria, it was really tough. In the shelter, in the room we were in, the wind started coming in, rain started coming in, and we started panicking.
When I came up in the morning to look around, I couldn't recognize the place. Everything was destroyed, totally.
I came, I look out, I told him, Gucci, everything is gone. Everything is gone.
For policymakers, the task of rebuilding after a shock, like a natural disaster, is a long and multifaceted process, lasting long after tarpaulins have been removed and homes rebuilt.
The shocks keep coming. And also very important to note is the magnitude of those shocks. I always give the example. Ivan in Grenada, 2004. Maria in Dominica, 226% of GDP in 2017. In contrast, Hurricane Katrina in the United States in 2005, 1% of GDP. Two countries destroyed, a small portion of a state in the United States destroyed. That is the magnitude of these shocks on our economies. So why do we take longer to recover? Because the shocks keep coming and the magnitude is large, proportionately far larger than it would be in a large country or economy.
These experiences underscore the challenges in current global mechanisms used to determine access to concessional financing, which do not take into account the multidimensional nature of vulnerability in the Caribbean.
Recently, the Caribbean Development Bank Economics Department, we undertook some analysis for the period 2008 to 2019. And the analysis, in a sense, sought to investigate how long it took our borrowing member countries to return to their pre-shock level of GDP after the crisis. And the analysis revealed that on average, it took our borrowing member countries 5 years to recover to their pre-shock level of GDP. And in some instances, some countries took as long as 9 years to recover. Now, when we compare that to advanced countries, the advanced countries were able to recover to their pre-shock level of GDP in about 3 years. The gross national income is the current metric that is used to assess a country's level of access to concessional finance. And we think that this GNI does not adequately assess the current state of development in the country. And we think so for several reasons. Firstly, when there's a devastation, as you know, let's say a devastation or natural hazard, for example, that happened in Dominica that contributed more than 200% in GDP of devastation. I mean, it literally wiped out the country. In a situation like that, income becomes relatively meaningless. It doesn't say anything about your state of development. In addition to that, it does not capture the long time that it takes for a country to recover. those years when the country is recovering, the country's pre-shock level of GNI does not help it in any way. And as a result, we believe that we need metrics that better capture this lived reality of many of our borrowing member countries in order to access their state of development. So this is why we think that there needs to be a more suitable measure. The CDB is proposing the recovery duration adjuster as a more suitable indicator because we think that an indicator to measure development needs to go beyond looking at just the susceptibility of the country to a natural hazard. We need to also include the resilience factors. What is the country doing in order to build resilience to these shocks? Yes, there were inherent vulnerabilities before, but this shock now changes the nature of those vulnerabilities, and it also affects the resilience conditions. So we believe that the framework needs to incorporate these changes, and it needs to consider as well access to finances, because access to finances will be a key ingredient in how long it takes for the country to build resilience and for them to recover. And because these are the key elements of the recovery duration adjuster, we're proposing this as an improved measure.
When a country faces a shock, liquidity is paramount. Countries need resources to be able to expedite recovery. And so the issue of access to finance, grants and concessional finance assumes extremely great significance. And that is why it is an analytical absurdity to rely on per capita income to consider and determine access to grants and concessional financing for the small states of the Caribbean. It is time, high time, that we move away from that flawed basis, and I welcome the focus of the CDB on the duration adjuster to better address what is a pressing and long-standing need of the borrowing member countries and countries of the Caribbean.
Distinguished governors, excellencies, observers, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, both in attendance and online. My name is Jason Cotton, and today my presentation will provide to you further insight into the Recovery Duration Adjuster, or RDA. In the presentation today, I would seek to explain to you how the Recovery Duration Adjuster RDA seeks to improve upon the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index. And for those of you who may not be aware, the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index is the framework that is being proposed by the international community to either replace or to be used with the GNI in order to determine access to concessional finance. I will also explain to you the conceptual underpinnings of the RDA, how we believe that it can influence access to concessional finance, and the way forward and the partnerships that we are seeking. But I want to begin today's discussion by highlighting three important ideas. And the first idea relates to the need to make the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index better by incorporating both vulnerability and resilience in the framework. The second big idea that we'll be speaking today about is the importance of resilience building in the sustainable development of a developing country and small and developing states. And the third big idea relates to the need for an adequate financing ecosystem to assist countries in achieving their sustainable development objectives. And I will build on these three ideas during the course of this presentation. And the argument we are making at the bank is that while the existing multidimensional vulnerability index, or MVI, being proposed is an improvement to the GNI, the current system that influences access to concessional finance, it does not go far enough in terms of capturing the realities of small island developing states. And so what we are saying is that this RDA, Recovery Duration Adjuster, has been designed to make the MVI better by incorporating the dimensions of not only vulnerability or the susceptibility of a country, but also the critical aspect of resilience building. And this is what you see in the graph before you. The RDA goes beyond vulnerability to consider the various dimensions of resilience building in its framework. Now, this is well known to you, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but the basis is that finance eligibility criteria and systems, they're not suited to the unique challenges and constraints of small states. Even when small states have high levels of GNI, they still face significant challenges because of exogenous shocks. This is well known to this group. In designing the RDA, we also considered three critical imperatives in the design. And the first is the need for a bridge between stabilization and long-term development. And we believe that in developing this bridge, the framework needs a holistic approach that integrates the debt sustainability framework of the IMF, the investment growth framework of the World Bank, and the resilience building framework of the United Nations. And we believe that integrating these three frameworks are critical in order to influence access to finance. The second critical imperative is that sustainable development is about improving the quality of life and the capabilities of persons. And an important component of that is the need to build resilience. We make the argument that the structural deficiencies of our region are there in part because of inadequacies of resilience building. And as such, what we are advocating in the framework is that any concept that seeks to give a sense of development must be holistic and incorporate all of the areas of resilience. We identified 5 in the RDA, 5 areas of resilience, and the design must incorporate all of those dimensions of resilience, even though in the execution may be in a temporarily coherent manner. And the final critical imperative of the framework is that we cannot achieve, next slide, we cannot achieve a sustainable development without access to a financing ecosystem that provides access to adequate and affordable finance to meet the development needs of the region. And here we propose in this financing ecosystem that there be various categories of finance. Finance for rescue, financing for recovery, and financing for repositioning, and various instruments in each of these categories of finance. Now, today, we are speaking about access to concessional finance. But we're not speaking about access to concessional finance in a way that creates a dependency on donor resources. Rather, the argument that we are making is that this concessional finance will be used for much needed resilience building, and so help to transition countries from the place of stabilization to the place of long-term development. So we are proposing through our RDA a vulnerability and resilience framework that goes beyond the susceptibility to a shock to consider how the country is building resilience, its ability to bounce back from the shock. And we're doing so because we observe that in the region and further afield, Our countries are being struck by shocks that are decimating their capital stock, wiping out their productivity, and this is constraining their development. And we have several examples of that. Many of these examples of this wipeout risk because of an exogenous shock are known to you. So I would move on. We also utilize the comparison of Florida and Dominica. Now we have the state of Florida and we have the country of Dominica. And we know that both of these are susceptible to a Category 5 hurricane. But we ask you the question, and we ask ourselves the question, who do you think would rebound faster? And we are saying that the answer to that question is the key in this recovery duration adjuster methodology. We propose, and you know that it is very likely that Florida, and the statistics tell us, will recover faster than, for example, a Dominica, for several reasons. Because in Dominica, a smaller island constrained, there will be deficiencies in terms of infrastructure, limited access to finance, lower capital efficiencies, etc. And these, in part, constrain the time period for recovery. Next slide, please. So the recovery duration adjuster integrates vulnerability and resilience in a dynamic and a forward-looking manner. And key to this framework is what we refer to as the internal resilience capacity. And I explain that internal resilience capacity as we go on. One slide back, please. So it's important at this stage to distinguish how the RDA is different from the multidimensional vulnerability index. In fact, we refer to the RDA as MVI plus because it does not discard the MVI, but it goes beyond what the MVI has proposed. And it does so in several ways. Firstly, it is holistic and multidimensional in terms of its approach. I explained a little bit in terms of the design, how we seek to incorporate that holistic perspective as compared to the partial approach of the MVI. Secondly, the RDA can be customized to specific shocks. And this is important. The RDA can be customized to a shock, whether that shock is a natural hazard, whether it is an earthquake, whether it is a tsunami, whether it is a volcanic eruption. Once we have the data, we can customize the RDA to the specific shock of the country situation, which is very different to an index, which is static and fixed and has inherent shortcomings. In addition to that, the RDA enables real-time analysis, which is critical for the policymaker. Indexes by nature, they are static, they are backward-looking, but the RDA provides the policymaker with the opportunity to have a glimpse into the contemporaneous effects of a shock on the economy. And so it is better, therefore, can assist better in policymaking. It is forward-looking as compared to the backward-looking approach of an index. It incorporates this very important aspect of internal resilience capacity. And this internal resilience capacity examines the structural inherent weaknesses of the country. It also looks at a shock and the impact that the shock has on the country in terms of how it affects those vulnerabilities and resilience and how those change as a result of the shock. And it also takes into consideration what access to finance this country has and how that influences its duration of recovery. And the RDA, of course, central to it is this idea of duration of recovery, and that is not in the MVI. So in this slide, we summarize the RDA framework. And what we are saying, in essence, in this slide is that the traditional measure of gross national income it is not adequate as a measure to access or determine access to concessional finance. We are proposing this RDA adjusted GNI measure as a more appropriate measure. And in this RDA, we have several components. The RDA considered shocks. Those shocks could be endogenous as well as exogenous shocks. But as we well know, it is the exogenous shocks. Those would be the ones that would be focused on if we're speaking about access to concessional finance. It also looks at the state of vulnerability in the country in all dimensions, economic, social, and environmental. It takes into consideration the event or the shock, the magnitude of that shock, the severity of that shock, but also what resilience or shock absorbing mechanisms the country has in place in order to mitigate that shock. Because that, in essence, is what would determine the duration of recovery. And once we have a sense of the time that it takes for that country to return to what we refer to as its pre-shock level of GNI, what we do then is we utilize a framework referred to as compensating variation. In essence, what that is doing, it is putting a dollar value to that duration of time, and that is what is used, that dollar value, to adjust the gross national income. Hence the name Recovery Duration Adjuster. And so in this graph, we just illustrate the principle here. What we're saying is that our countries, small and developing states, developing countries, on their development pathway, the development path is being reflected by the black line in the graph. But when a shock occurs, we refer to that black line as the baseline or the natural growth path. When a shock occurs, what happens is that that development pathway is changed and it pivots downwards to the red line. So in this instance here, let's call this country Dominica. In the year 2017, there was an exogenous shock. The exogenous shock contributes to a reduction in the productive capacity of the country. Its marginal efficiency of investment is affected. And as a result, the country now pivots to this red line. Now, it's important to observe what is happening here. During the period of time, 2017 to 2028, the country's development pathway causes its income per capita to be beneath the 8,000 level of income per capita before the shock. But what is happening, and our argument is that during this rescue and recovery period, during this 11-year period from 2017 to 2028, and the numbers are just illustrative, the country, we are saying, should not be assessed on that 8,000 level of GNI, because during that time, the productive capacity is significantly changed. And what we are seeking to estimate is those two colored areas in the graph. The structural cumulative loss, which refers to those inherent vulnerabilities and how those inherent vulnerabilities affect welfare in the country, as well as when there is a shock, the shock would be associated with additional losses. And it is these two categories of losses, the structural cumulative loss and the post-shock cumulative loss, that we are trying to quantify. And once we get a cost value for that, we're then proposing that this cost is what is being used to take away from the GNI to get this adjusted figure. So we introduce another illustration, and here we're saying another scenario that is very familiar to most persons. Some countries, when they are hit by a shock, for example, in 2017, and the country is on the path to recovery, again, this red line, the country sometimes, unfortunately, may be hit by another shock. And we're showing that, for example, here in the year 2023, let us say, when the country is on the recovery path, unfortunately, it is struck by another shock which contributes to a further reduction in productive capacity and further extends this duration of recovery. So as a result, because of this multiple shock scenario, the duration of recovery has been extended from 2028 to the year 2033. And we're saying that with this extension in the duration of recovery, of course, the cumulative cost to the country during this period would have increased. So, I mean, this is the part where most persons would want to zone out. So I'm just talking you through the logic of it. I promise I'm not going to go into any of the symbols, right? But all we're saying here is that, remember the black line that you would have seen before, right? The black line is this baseline development trajectory. We're saying that in order to compute this baseline development trajectory, we're looking at the vulnerabilities in the country and in the economic, social, and environmental dimensions, and we're looking at the various aspects of resilience. So this is the first step of the 6 steps in the RDA methodology. In the second step, so now we're on the red line. The red line, the shock has occurred. And so now what we're trying to quantify is how this shock and the associated costs related to the shock. So we're saying this internal resilience capacity relative to the red line that you would have seen is equivalent to the change in gross national income that is caused by the shock. We look at the initial vulnerability factors. We look at how those vulnerability factors would have changed because of the shock. We look at the initial resilience capacity. We look at how that resilience capacity would have changed because of the shock. And we also take into consideration the magnitude and the severity of the shock and the country's access to finance. The third step is we calculate the structural cumulative loss. Again, remember the diagram, there were those 2 colored parts. So we're just adding the colored part on the top with the colored part on the bottom. The structural cumulative loss with the post-structural cumulative loss. The internal resilience capacity cumulative loss, what we're doing is that we are saying that when we quantify that pre-shock development path, we are taking the cumulative differential of that pre-shock cumulative path from the pre-shock GNI level. I know that one may have gone over a few persons' heads, but just stay with me here. The fifth dimension is we calculate the total cumulative loss. And the total cumulative loss, again, is just the addition of the structural cumulative loss and the post-shock cumulative loss. So all the losses related to the various dimensions in the graph. And the final step, the 6th step, is the internal resilience capacity adjusted GNI, whereby we take the gross national income and we multiply that by the ratio of the post-shock development path over the pre-shock development path. Next slide, please. There's a lot happening on this slide. I'm not going to go through it. The point that we're trying to make on this slide is that we explain in the economic, social, environmental dimensions of vulnerability, and under the various components of resilience, we highlight them. We can come back if persons have questions, but I think what's important to take away here is this point. The recovery duration adjuster does not seek to be innovative in terms of these indicators. In fact, we try to align the indicators as much as possible with the indicators that the UN and other frameworks would utilize in order to ensure universality in terms of the data that goes in. The main innovation is in terms of the methodological framework and how we capture this duration to recovery. And here we explain how this recovery duration adjuster vulnerability and resilience framework can help us to move from the use of gross national income
to internal resilience capacity as the measure to influence access to concessional finance. So we begin with the recovery duration adjuster. As I said, that is the first component. The recovery duration adjuster allows us to cost this financing gap related to the shock and the pre-shock scenario. But we don't stop there. We go beyond that costed value to now look at a vulnerability and resilience assessment tool. And in this assessment tool, what we are seeking to do is go behind that costed number to get a better sense as to what is driving these vulnerabilities, what is driving the resilience. Why is this duration capacity so long? So we can liken that second component to like a financial stability assessment, which takes a deeper dive into the financial sector in that case. Then we go further. That allows us to determine key policy recommendations that allows us in component 3 to develop a roadmap for monitoring and tracking progress of countries as they move from stabilization to long-term development. And the fourth and most important component is this internal resilience capacity index. And this internal resilience capacity index, what we seek to do is similar to the GNI, which has various thresholds for determining where countries have access or do not have access to concessional finance. We utilize in economics a panel methodology, place all of the countries that we can find data on. The countries now, based on this recovery duration adjuster, adjusted GNI, helps to now determine internal resilience capacity adjusted thresholds for countries and where they have access to concessional finance. And that is what we now can possibly help to determine which countries and how access to finance is determined in this new methodology. This is a bit about the vulnerability and resilience assessment tool. For the sake of time, I will just go to the final slide. The recovery duration adjuster vulnerability and resilience framework really helps to enable what we are thinking about as an improved mechanism to influence how countries have access to concessional finance. And this is what we're trying to illustrate here. And the final slide I want to say is that, you know, the bank, we have made a lot of progress in terms of our RDA. And we have some preliminary estimates which we're refining. But I think the critical thing is coming out of this discussion today, we are seeking partnerships. We have explained our framework to several partners, to AOSIS, we had conversations with United Nations, with ECLAC, etc. But a key outcome of this is for others to come on board with us in what we see as an exciting journey as we seek to provide what we think is a more appropriate measure to access concessional finance. So join with us on this journey. Hashtag recovery duration adjuster.
Jason for thank you, Jason, for that that presentation, which I anticipate will set the stage for a robust conversation. Good afternoon. My name is Ian Durant, and I am your moderator. So that was some heavy stuff. Yeah. So let me just try to break it down for you. In essence, there are three things that you need to consider when assessing the impact of a shock on a country and assessing the issues that separate one country from the next. There's the possibility or the probability of a shock affecting the country, the extent of the shock, and the duration of the impact. So we are basically arguing that if you use today's GNI to determine a country's access to concessional resources for the next 10 years, you're pretty much ignoring the probability, the extent, and the duration of a shock that could occur within that 10-year period for which you are assessing impact, right? So this is very, very critical, because what it means is that a country might have limited, a country that looks extremely wealthy might have limited access today, but because of a shock over the next 10 years, its growth is affected. And let's say, for example, it has to access commercial debt at commercial rates, let's say 6, 7, 8%, and it's experiencing growth on average of about 2%. What that does is that it builds an explosiveness into the debt to GDP ratio of the country. So you're pretty much pushing a country potentially into a debt overhang situation, or worsening a debt overhang situation, by cutting off access to concessional resources, by judging it on today's GNI. So that's basically what we are arguing with the RDA. So having said that, I am very excited to engage this esteemed panel. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to have 2 rounds of questions. I'm going to ask the panel 2 rounds of questions, and then I'm going to open it up. I'm going to open it up to the audience here and the online audience. You want to say something? Okay, so we're going to allow the president. I thought I was in charge, but clearly I'm not. We're going to allow the president to make a few remarks as well.
I see you are wearing your glasses. You couldn't see me.
Yeah.
Let's go to the slide with the duration gap. I know Ian gave us a lot of information and he did a terrific job in doing this. But I think there are a couple of things we need to, Jason, a couple of things we need to unpack. The first thing is, what exactly are we trying to do? One is, what do we have now, which is a GNI method of allocating finance, concessional finance, can be summarized in 2 numbers. If your GNI is less than $1,200 US per capita, you qualify for concessional finance. If it is twice that number, $2,400 US per capita, you graduate, you do not qualify. That's the bottom line. And in between, you have a shade of gray where you may or may not, depending on some other things. The fundamental problem is that our countries, in principle, have all graduated. And therefore, they do not have access to concessional finance. So what we are looking for is a more equitable method of channeling, allocating that concessional finance. And so in principle, forget all the symbols that Jason had on the screen. We want something that says, let's replace GNI by something else. And that something else will be internal resilience capacity. And we want to do the same thing we did for GNI, 2 magic numbers. For example, if the internal resilience capacity is less than 0.3, you qualify. Just like 1,200, less than 1,200, you qualify. If it is more than 0.6, just like more than 2,400, you do not qualify. And if you fall in between, it's here or there. Okay, so that's the ultimate goal. We want to be able to say, replace GNI by internal resilience capacity. So once we understand that this is what we are trying to do, and we want to replace it by the same switch points, the two thresholds, the question is, what's the difference between GNI and internal resilience capacity? Now, the world understands GNI as this. That line. It's a number. And what exactly does that number say? It says the activity that occurs in your country on a year-by-year basis determines your gross national income. Now, having established that GNI is not equivalent to development, and having established that GNI does not mean financing need, the community of institutions, spearheaded by my good friend here, Dr. Nurse, I'm not putting you on the spot, have said that what we need to do is to come up with a multi-dimensional vulnerability index. Now, forget the nice fancy word multi-dimensional. A vulnerability index. Now, you might want to say, what does a vulnerability index do and what does it say? And again, I want to show you this on this line. What a vulnerability index says is that you are on this black line because you are vulnerable. And in the slide, just if you go forward too, in the slide with the various, one more, come, keep going. This guy, no, one more. Two more, actually. One more. Oh, you have a lot more slides, right there. What a vulnerability index says is if you have low export concentration, if you are remote, if your population is lying in low coastal areas, if your share of agriculture and forestry is low, go back to the duration gap, then what this means is that your ability to grow, one more, yeah, good. Your ability to grow is limited. Therefore, in principle, you should be out here, up above that line. That's your true potential. In other words, developed countries should be up here. We as developing countries are down here. Why? Because of the vulnerabilities, the constraints that prevent you from growing. So all of that is good. But all it says is, if I take a snapshot of where you are, what I am arguing is you're not growing as good, as strong, as fast as you can because of vulnerabilities. And I end up measuring those vulnerabilities. So it's a measure of why you cannot grow as much as you should. But here's where the rubber hits the fence. When the hurricane passes through, or the drought passes through, the shock occurs, pandemic, Ukraine war, the global financial crisis, Maria, Irma. What happens at that point? Can you genuinely say that this line, which was why you were not able to grow as fast, is still relevant? And the answer to that is categorically no. Because your entire situation has changed. Your entire situation has changed. And so what we are looking to do is to say, before the event, the natural hazard or the shock occurs, vulnerability as we are talking about it is appropriate. It tells us why we are not able to grow the way we could grow, potential-wise. But once the shock occurs and you hit and fall, as in the case of Dominica, then you cannot say anymore that the vulnerability line you are on is the same. You have been pushed down, and you've pushed down now from the black line to the red line. And so the relevant question now is not how much you could grow, but really how long it will take you after the shock to get back to where you were before the shock. Okay? And that element here, which is the length of time, the duration it takes, depends critically, we believe, on one factor, which is access to finance. And so the point about the Florida and the Dominica example that Jason raised is very appropriate. The same Category 5 hurricane hits Dominica and hits Florida. Okay? You cannot talk about susceptibility as any difference. They are exactly the same. But after it hits, one state gets crashed. In another case, an entire country gets crashed. And we heard only a couple days ago, 75 to 85% of the 30,000 homes in Dominica in 2017 were destroyed. Now, not as many percentage-wise were destroyed in Florida, but the key difference was that after Maria hit, Florida had access to FEMA funds, access to concessional finance that enabled them to recover faster. Therefore, that duration was shrunk. Okay? That duration was shrunk. So we are making the point that by adding this duration, and that duration itself is a function of the capacity to recover. That's what we are calling the internal resilience capacity. And we can do that for every country in the world. And I can tell you what we will end up with is developed countries will have high capacity to recover. Less developed countries will have low capacity to recover, irrespective of their per capita income. Because when the hurricane comes and it crashes, it doesn't distinguish whether you had high or low per capita income. And so that is what we are trying to do to distinguish between the two particular elements. Okay? Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, President Leon, for that intervention. So let's get going with the panel. As I said, I'm gonna start with an initial round of questions for each panelist, and I'm gonna start with Ambassador Webson. Now, AOSIS is a key player in supporting small island developing states in their advocacy for increased access to concessional finance to support sustainable development. This role has become more important in the context of the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and building resilience against future shocks. How, in your opinion, can the RDA framework support the ongoing work of AOSIS? Ambassador?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Distinguished governors, excellencies, colleagues, friends in the room and online. I don't know if I could replicate the zoning probability of Jason. I hope you don't zone out or zone in, but I hope you stay with us, because this is for us a very important topic, and most importantly, something that we want to see come true to be a reality for small island developing states, as we have been working at this for decades. Without any doubt, Mr. Moderator, the small island developing states are amongst the most vulnerable group of countries in the global community that are experiencing severe shocks from COVID-19 pandemic and worsening shocks brought on by climate change. Access to global finance, such as concessional financing or climate financing and debt relief for these islands are difficult. These, we believe, should mirror the unique and extreme vulnerabilities of the islands. Yet, today, as you have been hearing, access falls woefully, and especially the islands in the Caribbean, despite the very clear evidence that the access mechanism being used, which denies opportunity and access to finances, as noted above, is unjust. We are referring here, as we speak in this conversation, somewhat to the COVID-19 pandemic and to climate change. And of course, the climate is important to us and is at the forefront of our consciousness, because we know from our climatologists that in the Caribbean, we are likely to experience a major climate disaster in one island or the other every 2 to 3 years. The vulnerability shocks that we face is not something new. It's not new to us. We know that these shocks create great human toll on our societies and significant suffering, and the dollar value is exponential. In fact, though, the Alliance of Small Island States, those of you who do not know of the Alliance of Small Island States, is a small group of all of the 39 small island nations in the United Nations family that came together over 30 years ago, initially built around its claim for climate change. And we will say to the globe that had it not been for the Alliance of Small Island States, we would not be speaking of climate change in the manner that we are today. And that group came together and has mushroomed and developed into a strong alliance within the United Nations system that now takes on sustainable development, oceans, and climate change. EOSIS has been advocating for a multi-dimensional vulnerability index for decades, as I said. We hope, however, with the momentum that we have gained and the United Nations Secretary General appointing with the president of the president of the General Assembly appointing a expert panel, that this panel will develop a framework that will finally recognize and gain recognition on the special circumstances of small island developing states across multiple dimensions. And just not, most importantly, that it is a universal index that is inclusive of all countries, so as to demonstrate what we already know that the extent of our vulnerability is relatively like none other group of countries for a number of the points already identified. Now let me turn my attention a little bit to the RDA, as we have been discussing the vulnerability index more urgently with the panel recently, and had the CDB work with us as they have indicated as part of their discussion. The RDA of the CDB, their framework has for us, we believe, the potential to increase access to financing and improves the resilience in vulnerable countries. And this will be done, we believe, over time as we work together. If, for instance, the RDA indicates a country's resilience will be improved, then it supports the conclusion that access to finance has helped countries overcome their vulnerabilities by making these countries more resilient to external shocks. You have heard how external shocks, how small island states are exposed to some, and I will speak to that further. Because of the lack of global data coverage, not all of the indicators used in the RDA might be transferable to the MVI. But the underlying methodology, we believe, is sound. In fact, the MVI structure currently being contemplated by the United Nations expert panel will have a component allowing countries to develop more personalized, if you might, in-depth resilience profiles. And I can foresee that the CDB through the RDA helping and playing a great role in the Caribbean to develop these in each country's respective profile. In this way, Mr. Moderator, resilience and the RDA framework may complement strongly the MVI that measures and appreciates the vulnerability of that we seek to improve access to finance. We may have to work together and develop models in order to prove concept so that the international community can fully appreciate this, the use of a new MVI and the coordination between the RDA and the MVI. I thank you.
Thank you very Thank you very much, Ambassador Webson, for reminding us that SIDS are among the most vulnerable countries in the world to shocks. And it is not only important for SIDS to have greater access to concessional resources, but it is just for them to do so. You reminded us that AOSIS has been advocating for increased access for years, and that there's an expert panel currently looking at the issue of a universal vulnerability index. So thank you for that. And of course, thank you for the endorsement of the RDA as a solid basis for assessing vulnerability and resilience and improving access to resources. So I'm going to turn now to our second panelist, Dr. Keith Nurse, and I'm going to ask him, Dr. Nurse, the RDA framework emphasized the need for SIDS to have expanded access to financing for development to support building resilience against exogenous shocks, including climate change and natural hazards, and the expansion of productive capacity while ensuring the sustainability of external debt. In your opinion, how important is resilience in fostering sustainable development in SIDS?
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Thanks very much to the panelists and to the CDB for the invitation to contribute to this, I think, really important discussion about a concept which I think, and I would say at the outset, I think has strong methodological capabilities to enhance our understanding of how to take the motto for this meeting to do better measurement and consequently do better targeting. And why is measurement so important and targeting so important? It allows us to plan, and it also allows us to implement. And one of the challenges for small states, and particularly here in the Caribbean, is what I call the implementation deficit disorder, which is that we have no shortage of plans, but our capacity to implement has often been compromised by a whole range of things. I'm not going to get into that specifically now. So one of the things that strikes me about the RDA concept in fact, which I like. But particularly the way it then is nuanced in terms of looking at the internal resilience capacity. And I think that this is where the rubber hits the ground. Because for a long time, for small states, we have harped on the issue of vulnerability, going all the way back to the Commonwealth, doing a publication back in the 1980s on vulnerability. And even back then, we were arguing that there are different kinds of vulnerabilities. There are vulnerabilities that are inherent. So the Caribbean is inherently vulnerable to hurricanes. We can't move the islands, and we can't tell the hurricanes to stop coming. Maybe the Sahara just has a different idea altogether, and it's tempering things a bit. So one disaster on top of another. But the point is this, there's another way of thinking about vulnerabilities, which is that there are quoted vulnerabilities. So if you know that you're inherently vulnerable to hurricanes and you don't do hurricane preparedness, then what you are doing is quoting further vulnerabilities. So the issue is not whether or not there's a risk or you have an exposure. Sorry, you have an exposure. We are exposed to this risk. Question is, what are you doing about it? And if you are not doing the preparedness, then you are quoting vulnerability. And I think that's the key point. So what strikes me about the RDA adjuster and this coming up with a new methodological framework called an internal resistance framework is that it gives us a new way of thinking and possibly a new way of responding to the level of exposure and risk that we have by being forward-looking, which is the point that Jason made in his presentation, and in effect using our planning frameworks to ensure that we mitigate the exposures and the risk. And so in that sense, I really want to compliment the work that's being done by the CDB. One of the hats that I wear, which my good friend, the president, referred to and called me out on, I'm on one of the UN committees. It's the UN Committee for Development Policy. And we are the ones that assess countries for graduation from least developed country status. And so we use many of these methodologies that Jason referred to. In fact, we use 3 key indicators. GNI, we use the Human Asset Index, which includes things like education, health, and other social factors. And then the third, as an environmental or economic vulnerability index, or the EVI. And what we have found is this. In the last several decades, in relation to least developed countries, it is the small states within the least developed country category that have graduated. So at the same time that we are saying that small states are the most vulnerable, it is the small states among the least developed country categories that have been the ones to graduate. So for example, Botswana was first, 1994, Cape Verde, 2007, the Maldives, 2011, Samoa in 2014, Equatorial Guinea in 2017, Vanuatu was due to graduate in 2020. That has obviously had to be deferred a bit. So it's small states, and the reason why is this. You only need to have 2 of the criteria to graduate. And so in small states, what you find is that if you have a particular economy that's, in many cases, they're often monostructural or mono economies. So the tourism sector can generate high levels of GNI, and the spillover or some of the surplus from that can easily be redistributed into the educational sector, the health sector, the infrastructure, and so on. So small states that have mono economies, and particularly through boom years, can generate significant growth in their human asset index. This is far more difficult for least developed countries that are larger, with large populations, large rural populations, and so on, and high levels of poverty historically. So the small states within the least developed country category have been the ones that have been able to pole vault out of the least developed country category for this very reason. Where they remain vulnerable, however, is in the EVI, the economic and environmental vulnerability indices. And so one of the concerns that we have at the UN Committee for Development Policy, and I'm speaking on my own personal capacity here, is that there's a strong potential, particularly with all of the exposures and risks that we're seeing with climate change, that many of these small states may reverse from graduating out of the LDC category. If all the climatologists are correct, then there's great concern. And you can well imagine countries like Maldives are already indicating that they are sinking or going to disappear. Tuvalu, Kiribati. So one of the concerns that we have is, how can you graduate a country that you know is going to be severely impacted? When I mean severely impacted, in some instances, we're talking about almost disappearing off the planet. And so this is a grave concern for us. And in that regard, the issue of the internal resistance capacity. Capacity. Yes, sorry. yeah, becomes the key indicator, or should be the driving or key indicator that we're using going forward. Which reminds me of the work of Amartya Sen, who talks about capabilities in terms of generating wellness and well-being. So let us get away from economic growth. That framework that we've been using for decades now has severe limitations going forward. If we take all of the sustainability issues that we have been talking about for the last few decades, because planet Earth can no longer continue to sustain human activity in the way in which it's currently configured, the strong fossil fuel use and so forth. So if we're using capacities and capabilities in general the same ways, it means then we need to be thinking about how do we restructure our economies and societies so that they are more sustainable and generate the kind of resilience we're talking about. So the issue, though, is not just about access to finance. I know we are at a bank meeting, and so banks like to talk about finance. But banks also like to talk about return on investment. Because if there is not an adequate return on the investment, then the financing doesn't look good. And so how do we ensure that the productive capacity of these economies and the processes of social innovation in these societies are such that when we invest in them, when we use the concessional financing, that we get an increased or improved return on investment. And so, although I like the RDA, the concept of recovery for me is not the real issue. We have to think beyond recovery to think about how do we reinvent these economies. If you look at all the indicators for Caribbean economies, we have the highest debt to GDP ratio. We have the highest food import bill per capita. Our use of energy, imported energy, high, especially in a context where we have natural sunlight, we should be utilizing renewables to a greater degree, etc. And I could go down the list. These are vulnerabilities that we are courting because we are not investing fast enough in renewables. We're not investing fast enough and strategically enough in feeding ourselves. And so the longer that we court those vulnerabilities, the higher the levels of exposure and risk. And we are courting them. So it's our responsibility, and this is where I like the role that the CDB is playing as a champion, to push this and to implement it so that we start thinking about how do we ensure that these countries can bounce back, but bounce back better, but bounce back through a process of innovation. Let's call it mission-oriented innovation. I know that last year your feature lecture speaker was Mariana Mascuto, who was a former member of the UN Committee for Development Policy. And so it's that kind of framework, very strategic. Let us identify where our vulnerabilities are and convert them into resilience frameworks. So I'll end my comments for now, Mr. Moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nurse. Some very profound points you made, reminding us that countries are being graduated in full view of existential challenges, and indicating as well that while it is important to increase access to concessional resources, it is important that there is a return on the investment in terms of the use of those resources in the form of higher growth and less vulnerability. So I thank you for those interventions. And if I may now turn to the third panelist, Professor Strobel. Now, based on your extensive research on the impact and policy implications of extreme climate events in the Caribbean, how do you see your research findings complementing the ongoing work at the CDB on the vulnerability and resilience framework?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Mr. Moderator, and for all the panelists and the interesting discussion so far, and the CDB for setting this up and inviting me. Let me just say, when I first saw this presentation, my first thought was kind of, if I'd seen this 15 years ago when I started doing research, this would have saved me a lot of trouble. Then, of course, I realized I would have been researching something else because most of it would have been done. And let me clarify a bit what I mean by that. So when I first started off, I was a little bit naive because I was interested in the impact of extreme climate events in the Caribbean. And so I took that same sort of approach. You know, you look at GDP or GNI, whichever the data are, and you think there's an impact, and then it recovers, and that's about it. And so what originally I and other researchers for other regions found, you find this kind of very large impact, but then when you start looking in the medium term, the data just gets very noisy, right? And what I realized at that stage then is you really have to kind of open up that black box to look inside with more higher frequency data, look at the components, all the different aspects. And that's what I appreciate about this particular approach. It tries to really look at the complexity and not ignore the complexity that's behind the impact of, let's say, extreme climate events, right? And that involves, you know, government policy, that involves recognizing a lot of these economies have been dealing with these events, well, since the beginning. They started, there's a lot of informal insurance mechanisms and all these things. So my particular research looks at the impact, and I think some of the results I have, you know, just provide support for the sort of approach you're taking. So, for instance, when I started looking at more high-frequency data, so usually one looks at annual data because that's what's available, you actually see, if you remember the graph that was here now explained on two occasions in two very different ways, you see exactly that sort of thing. There's this sort of initial drops, so that's the initial damage. Right, then there's sort of the indirect business interruptions, all these things that kind of goes down. And then there's this kind of very long, sometimes medium-term recovery, right? And in the data, you can't really see so much difference when you, let's say, statistical analysis, because different economies seem to react differently. And then the question then is why? And I think it has to do with this resilience question in this regard. And when you start then looking in the black box further, there's lots of evidence that kind of indicates that that is an important issue. So for instance, if you take, let's say, gross national product or gross domestic product that I look at, and you divide it in its components, you see, for instance, in the first year investment goes up. That makes sense because, you know, they have to reinvest in infrastructure and those things. But then 3 or 4 years later, investment goes down again. And what that indicates to me is, of course, okay, these economies use their current expenditure to invest in infrastructure, in rebuilding resilience and those sort of things. But then somebody has to pay for it later on. And if they had concessional finance for this, then they could forego those sort of losses and the long-term implications that has for that. If you look at the external sector, for instance, you find imports rise in the beginning. That's probably with the import of construction material, foodstuff if agricultural sectors damaged in this regard. And then you find 2 or 3 years later, exports fall again. Right? So clearly has some indirect implications on the rest of the economy. I think the most interesting thing is you find that in terms of, let's say, consumption by private households, that goes down 2 or 3 years later, right? And I'll maybe speak a little bit later if it comes to another question about why that is. But of course, you find that government consumption goes up, right? And that's an important issue because when you then divide it and look into revenue and expenditure, you find that instantly revenue goes down, right? And that's the whole idea behind this catastrophic Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility to have governments get over that initial one when revenue is not coming in because people are not spending, they can't pay public wages and those sort of things. But then, of course, what you find in the longer term, so for several months and years, expenditure goes up. Of course, what does that mean? You're spending more, but you're taking in less income. So debt levels go up, right? They stay up for a very long time. And the alarming thing is most of that debt seems to be financed by foreign debt, right? And if you already have economies that have a high debt level, and you have to borrow on the foreign market, what's going to happen? They're going to charge you high rates. So I think you kind of get pushed into this very long, vicious cycle. You owe more at higher rates, and it's difficult to pay back. So building some sort of resilience in that regard in terms of financing or realizing that or categorizing countries according to the debt level could be very helpful. There's other interesting aspects. If you look sort of at what I call the monetary sector, you find foreign reserves immediately fall. That makes sense with imports rising and exports falling in this regard. And we know all the problems that come from foreign reserves. You find then that, and I guess for a lot of Caribbean countries, this is a big issue that central banks that push kind of fixed exchange rate policies, they're a little bit buffered with that, but still there's an impact in that regard. As Dr. Nurse was mentioning in terms of the food sector, you know, if you look at inflation, that goes up immediately. That's going to be very costly, and particularly it's food inflation. So you have agrarian economies destroyed, households with less income, and then food prices go up and house prices as well. So the cost on the individual households is relatively large. So you have these factors there. You can also break down the economies into the individual sectors. So I'm just going to focus on the 2 main ones in part because that's where mostly data is in there. Tourism, as you would expect, there's a big fall in tourism for a few months. You find it a little bit larger for cruise versus air arrivals tourism, and that's of course a big issue in that regard. I mean, on the one hand, you know, there's always the argument that cruise tourism doesn't add so much into a local economy, but they seem to react larger, right? And it's partially, from what I understand, is these big tourism Caribbean cruise companies, they have these packages and they can instantly adjust. If Antigua is hit by a hurricane, they just move a destination somewhere else. Air arrivals, you also have an impact. In terms of agricultural sector, it can be up to 1 or 2 years. It depends if it's the banana sector. So you have these big sectors being impacted. Now, it doesn't look like in the long term, but that doesn't mean it doesn't feed into the economy. And there's these really long-term effects here. As a matter of fact, I remember when I first started to do this research and I focused just on GDP, you know, after a lot of work, I was very proud of it. And I presented in front of, I think it was general audience. I think it was in Jamaica at a Sir Arthur Lewis Social and Economic Research Institute. And I started to show the impact. And I said, well, you know, it was something about the average hurricane causes a 7%, I think, drop in growth, and then it disappears. And I remember there was somebody in the audience who was an academic, and they raised their hand and they say, you know, Dr. Strobel, I find your results offensive because the IMF is going to come in and say, well, look, Dr. Strobel said it only lasts a year, so we have nothing to worry about. Whereas I know my cousin is still suffering from 7 years ago when the hurricane hit. So I think, you know, the way you approach with this particular index, understanding the complexity, and it's a very challenging task, it says, I guess you know better than me, but it really is an understanding of how these events impact economies. And I think with the simple thing like G&I, it's just not going to help a lot of countries. Some countries are going to get finance when they probably don't need it, and other ones are not going to get it when they really do need it, right? And that's just going to exacerbate this. And it's like a treadmill. And you see the same sort of things with, you know, what we in the literature call, but what the Mr. President called about these, when you have an event following another one, we call them cascade or compound events. And there's ongoing literature in that. And it really seems to make a difference in there. Because if you're hit with a hurricane 2 years later, you still have a high debt levels, then it goes up again. Households are trying to recover and those sort of things. You know, it has a long-term impact. And by dividing it up into these different sections, you know, classifying countries according to the relevant indicators, I think it's going to be very helpful in terms of getting these countries, to move forward and become more resilient internally.
All right, thanks very much for that. Thanks for those insights, Professor Strobel. You mentioned the cycle of recovery, growth, impact, and the expenditures that then have to be undertaken to, recover from the impact. And in many instances, what is happening is that countries like ours are spending twice on the same productive capacity. So, you've incurred debt twice to pretty much achieve the same level of production. And this is what helps in terms of causing the overhang that we see. Of course, you mentioned also the important issue of export concentration, the fact that these countries are highly exposed to a single export sector. And this manifests itself in frequent starts and stops as far as GDP is concerned. So thanks for those insights. So I'm going to have another round of questions. I think we have half an hour. Of course, I'm willing to interrupt if I see any hands raised. Anyone wants to ask a question, but if not, I'm going to go to a second round of questions, and I'm going to ask Ambassador Webson. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on how best to incorporate vulnerability and resilience in a framework that can support the long-term sustainable development of developing countries. Can you elaborate a bit on the current perspectives on how this framework can help SIDS build more resilient economies, Ambassador?
Thank you very much again, Mr. Moderator, and thanks to the members of the panel for this really very important and exciting discussion. I just thought I'll raise, before I answer the question directly, just to Mr. Nurse, maybe we should have a conversation offline around your role within the committee, and also maybe we should get the expert panel to speak to the ECOSOC group a little bit. Because as we think of the situation and the three measures you use, while the environmental measure cannot change because of our geography, which makes us beautiful, but makes us most beautifully vulnerable as well. Education, which is one of the big human index measurement, the OECS, of which there's a few OECS countries who have graduated and are in their situation, the OECS was defined as that's having the weakest education structure, graduates, the least graduates, and one of the weakest structures in the Caribbean. And yet, some of their countries, because of their GNI, has reached that level of graduation. So maybe those are some things that we might want to have a greater discussion on at some point. More to the point of the question, today, small island states, the economies are, as you know, ravaged by numerous external shocks. The COVID-19 has not only eroded the public health system in many of these countries, but it has also really slashed important sources of income. It has damaged, as we talked earlier, the tourism industry. It has damaged remittances, which is an important part of many small islands, whether they're in the ACE, the Pacific or the Caribbean region. And it has increased debt levels from severe to, as we say in the Caribbean, crucial. It has really moved it to significant levels at frightening levels. We heard this morning most Caribbean islands are over 60% and some are over 100% to their GDP. Sudden and gradual shocks from climate change continue to plague us and injure our economies. Slow onsets, of course, hurricanes and other natural disasters has crippled vital infrastructure and has really wrecked small islands' economies. And we must now think of the impacts like loss of agricultural, many of the things we have already spoken of here this afternoon, what that has on any prospect of stability and building. The MVI must be seen to improve access for these vulnerable small islands to financing and enable us to build resilience in a sort of constant and sustainable manner. And that sort of falls into what we're talking about, building resilience for the future. And that's what we talk in the climate space about mitigation. And example, if I'm to be practical here, many of the SIDS are essentially barred from access to ODA, development aid, currently because of the failing that they meet the outdated standards, right, that we talked about, the outdated GNI measurement. And that has barred many of us small island states from receiving any sort of support. And to expand eligibility, we believe, for ODA, we have to look at this new criteria that we are talking about so much today. And in order that we talk a lot about building and increasing investment. And as Dr. Nurse said, the banks like to talk about money. So we have to talk, have to talk about increasing investment through finance and so on. And if we're going to do that, we have to allow these islands an opportunity to receive concessional financing. Not that not just to rebuild, but to rebuild for the future and to address the questions that was placed before us by Dr. Nurse. And that will be helpful in terms of for, as you know, as it stands now, everything for small island states is far more expensive than any other group of islands. The climate crisis is more expensive for us to recover from. Debt is more expensive for small islands. I'm sure as you follow the current crisis, you realize that developed countries can borrow at ridiculously low rates, while small island nation states have to borrow at some very expensive rates, very high rates. And that cannot be part of how the global community should develop. We talked of food being expensive, and just the whole picture does not work well for us. Debt relief mechanisms for most vulnerable countries that must be in place. The framework that we talk about can allow small islands to better manage their public debt, which have grown in the last, especially during this crisis. And I use the word grown very likely because it hasn't grown, it has ballooned in many countries. Our debt is dangerously over leveraged, and we are essentially, and really for all intent and purposes, we are both figuratively and practically underwater. As I said in a speech couple months ago, if debt don't drown us, we'll be drowned by the oceans from hurricanes. So greater control over debt will also allow us to focus on public health and other priorities, spending to build resilience in coastal communities like these islands. There are ways here that the MVI can enable small islands to develop more sustainable and to be more resilient in our economies, and would be the tool that we can use, working together and coupling it with things like the RDA, working together to be able to plan better, manage our economies better, and to be able to have a clearer pathway. So we do not, after each disaster, have to ask or reach out. It is understood what the setback of the disaster. And the Caribbean is a classic example of how these things happen. As I said earlier, every 2 or 3 years, the Caribbean can expect a Category 5 hurricane. Some island will be hit. And that island may be one that has been graduated. And the graduation that the international community said is the only graduation that anyone knows where nobody is happy to graduate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Now we have a question from the audience, and I'm going to invite
Great. Thank you very much. A really, really interesting conversation, and one which I know everyone in the room is on the same page and really excited about how we move forward this agenda together. Two questions, if I may, just really quickly. So the first is about data quality. So when we watched that presentation, I think that the methodology looked really robust. I'm sure it overwhelmed all of us. I even did a degree with advanced econometrics, and I still didn't understand any of it. But we trust it's a robust methodology. But I guess the key tends to then be about data quality. So what we put in, of course, is going to heavily influence what comes out. So at the moment, if you were to have two different rooms, an economist in different rooms, and they were to put their own data in, would we be getting the same type of outputs, or is a lot of the data subjective, or do we not have the data quality we need yet? And if that's the case, can we build it? Thinking about the theme of the conference about measuring better and targeting better. So I'd really love to hear about data quality and what we can do in that space. A second question, if I may, and this one is just to ask for further clarification in the methodology about what is in the control of countries. So when I look at how the World Bank allocates IDA at the moment, it uses GNI per capita, but it also uses a country policy and institutional assessment. So that's basically 16 criteria that judge basically how sound a country's policies are. So it allocates money based on GNI per capita plus an assessment of how responsible policies are. So when we compare the RDA, it would be good just to not compare against GNI per capita, but it'd be good to understand how does the RDA include assessments of what countries are doing themselves as well. So that aspect as well. Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ian, before you go, can you identify yourself?
I am Ian Mills, from the UK. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. And please, when you're asking your questions, please identify yourselves at the lectern. So the second question is interesting because I think it synthesizes some points that have been made by the individual panelists in the sense that it separates or it points to the separation of what a country has control over. And you talked, Dr. Nurse, about return on investment, but also the vulnerabilities which have been identified by, I guess, all panelists. So I'm going to throw that question out. I don't know who wants to take it. About the two questions. I'm going to impose one more rule. Panelists, anyone wants to take those two questions? So the two questions, one relates to data quality. Is the data good enough? And are the results that we get out of it credible? And as well a clarification on the methodology about what is in control of the country, what is in control of the country, and what is not. I'm going to give. Let him go first. I'm going to give the panelists the opportunity to respond to the question, and then, President, I'm going to. I may allow you to come in. I haven't decided yet.
Yeah, after you, I want.
Thanks, Dr. Nurse.
Let me take a bit of a stab. I'm not going to answer the questions specifically or directly because I knew that you all had a range of questions to me, and in part they dovetail with what the other Ian has asked. At the UN Committee for Development Policy, we have adopted an increasingly differential stance, which is rather than just waiting for countries to arrive at some graduation threshold, we're now thinking, how can we help them get to the graduation thresholds? And once they get there, how do we facilitate their smooth transition into this graduated state? Because with graduation comes a reduction in terms of access to international support measures. like concessionary financing. So that's the key point. There are other things. So for example, access to certain tariff-free or low tariff access to certain markets, which is really important, for example, for a country like Bangladesh, which is currently an LDC, and a lot of its exports, particularly clothing and textile exports, enjoy a number of trade policy mechanisms that give them access to certain markets, right? But it also includes other things in relation, for example, to their pharmaceutical industry. What we find, though, is for the least developed countries, is that many of them, even when they have access to these international support measures, are unable to access them. We did a study about 3 years ago, and it was a bit of a surprise to us. So the international support measures, which includes not just concessionary financing or trade access, they may even involve access to green financing or climate financing and so on. And what we are observing is that many of these, particularly small states, don't have the administrative capacity to go through all the hoops and the high transactional costs and the high administrative costs to access these international support measures. So who are these measures designed for? One can ask. And so it may well look good on paper, but in reality, the capacity of these countries to access these things is very limited. So one of the things that we've been working on, and we're doing this in collaboration with other agencies, is to improve and create a level of coordination among the various UN agencies so that we can help the countries access these measures. Because having them on paper alone is not going to make a difference. So I think that is a really important dimension, which is not necessarily well articulated in the literature or in the media. The other thing is this that we are doing is, and this comes to Jason's presentation, and the key point that I think he's made, is that many of the traditional data sets focus on vulnerability, are backward looking. It tells you what has happened in the past. So you're looking in a rearview mirror as opposed to looking through your, the front glass of the car and seeing what's coming down the pipeline. So that's why the internal resistance capacity. I keep getting it wrong, man. Resilience capacity.
Internal resilience
capacity, yes. No. But this internal resilience capacity needs to be countenanced by an understanding of what's coming down the pipeline. So you need to be projecting into the future, 10 years, 20 years down the line. What are the key issues that are going to be impacting on these economies? And this is where you need a new set of data. So to come back to Ian's point, the other Ian's point, what data do we need to assess these countries' capacity in terms of resilience? Is not just what they have on the ground now, is our assessment of what's coming down the pipeline. Okay? And that means then we need to be projecting into the future and setting up a range of mechanisms. So one of the things that we are doing in the UN Committee for Development Policy is we have constructed something called Enhanced Monitoring Mechanism, where we identify a suite of indicators which tell us when a country is in crisis or going into crisis. It's sort of like an early warning mechanism. And so we've been looking at a range of data sets. And this is where, so for example, I worked on Tuvalu and Kiribati. Wow. I mean, we think we have a challenge here in the Caribbean. Well, look at the Pacific. The level of data and quality of data is very challenging. However, we apply the 80-20 rule, which is that we can take proxies and use those because we know historically that this is an indicator. So for example, when a hurricane or disaster hits a particular developing country, we know a couple of things happen. One, first off, the use of telecoms go up. Everybody's sending messages to everyone. And then when the telecoms infrastructure crashes, no telecoms. So you know almost immediately if you are tracking just the telecoms data for a country, whether it's been hit by a crisis or not. The other thing that happens, and relates to what Ambassador Webson mentioned in part, is that we know that when a disaster hits a country like our own, remittances and the support from our diaspora communities jumps very quickly. In fact, they are more responsive than all the intergovernmental agencies and the UN agencies and so on. Because we do know, and that's another data we are attempting to track, is that many of the international agencies and the foreign governments make commitments very early, but when you track the disbursements, there's a huge gap between the commitments and the disbursements.
Absolutely.
Right? The money never shows up in many instances.
True.
So that's something that we need to be tracking as well. And what I'm suggesting is this, is that by and large, we have most of the data that we need to make a fairly critical assessment. We don't have to overthink the thing. All right, we already know historically what the impacts are, and my colleague, Professor Strobel, I think really highlighted the key elements. You could see the impact that it has on exports, imports, internal consumption, and these things. These are fairly standard now. And so let us use what we have and get moving rather than waiting for perfection in terms of the data sets. What was the expression? Don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. I think that applies here. So I hope I've responded adequately enough, Mr. Moderator.
Yes, thanks. Just want to note your resistance to resilience. Okay? And I need for you to adjust that. Yeah. But anyhow, look, I wanna bring in our online audience because there'll be an additional opportunity for the audience in the room, to have a chat after we close off. And I don't want for our online audience to miss an opportunity to engage the panelists. And I think that this is a very interesting question. I know that there'll be quite a few of you chomping at the bit to respond to it, including Jason and the president, who is not going to get a chance to respond before we close off. But look, can a similar model be designed for anticipatory actions, stroke adaptation? Is that in the making? I assume that should be. Is that in the making? I want to assure you that it is, and this is what the RDA is about. But let me allow Jason to handle that question.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator. You're coming back to the data quality question, I hope. But
I will.
Let me answer the immediate question. The vulnerability and resilience assessment tool, in essence, is seeking to do that. The assessment tool seeks to look into what is happening in terms of the policy and institutional environment. There was a question by the gentleman before that was saying, how does the CPIA fit into this framework? But the vulnerability and resilience assessment tool, the CPIA, because what we're seeking to assess is the quality of the policy and institutional framework. So existing indicators like the CPIA, we're not seeking to reinvent the wheel, but we're utilizing frameworks like that, the CPIA, the debt sustainability analysis. Oh yes, sorry. Yes, the country poverty and institutional assessment that is used by the World Bank. It is used by the CDB and international organizations. What it seeks to do is to give a sense as to the strength of the policy and institutional environment in a country. So it looks at various areas. It would look at the country's fiscal policy, it would look at its monetary policy, trade, etc. A deeper diagnostic, as it will, to give a sense as to what are the policy prescriptions the country has done in order to strengthen its ability to withstand a shock. And so in our vulnerability and resilience assessment tool, we're taking those existing tools, which are internationally recognized, and allowing that to feed into our diagnosis of how we come up with these policy prescriptions. I will stop there.
All right, thank you. So we have, let me see if I can take one more from our, we have 9 more minutes. This question here says, shouldn't the question of debt forgiveness be part of this conversation? Let me throw that out. Okay, Professor Strobel.
I mean, that's one of those very difficult questions. And the discussion is really, you know, it's kind of what we economists, well, there's 3 economists here on the board, as far as I can tell. I'm not sure if you're also an economist, Mr. Ambassador. It's probably an insulting question, yeah.
It is a very difficult question to answer, but answering it within this context is particularly challenging. But within the context of the crisis that we face, we have been raising to ECOSOC and others, the whole issue of debt forgiveness and debt relief. We have the globe. We have done this before through HIPAA. And we have been saying for small island states, debt forgiveness should be in the discussion, at least, as we consider the challenges we face as small island nations. Before you close, though, and I want to go back to the data question. So I'll come back to that when you're ready.
All right, thanks. So, we have 7 minutes left. Mr. President, can you respond to that question in 3 minutes? 3 minutes? 2 minutes. I'm putting you on the clock.
Oh, yeah.
You wanted to respond to that?
I could, yeah. I mean, depending on.
Oh, I thought you were okay.
Oh, yeah, no.
So did you have some of my seconds? You need to reset the clock.
No. You're taking up some of your seconds now. No,
No, I was going to make 2 points. One is that the framework that is used, the IRC, is a function not only of vulnerability but of resilience.
Yeah.
And resilience has 5 buckets, one of which is institutional resilience. So the point you made about the CPIA as being part of is clearly integrated within the framework. And that is one of the things we do, is we emphasize we have a framework, not an index. And how you model this allows you to open it to all of the points I think Ian was making. The second, on data quality, I think was touched by Keith. Data by definition is always looking in the rearview mirror. It's happened. That's what makes it data. And so your role is to use the data you have to be able to project forward. And so the focus of having a forward-looking line is to move from post-mortem analysis into pre-mortem analysis. And I think that's the point, Keith, you're making. And so it becomes a matter of how well you model such that you have projections of the impact going forward. And it won't be data, it'll be projections, which by definition you can use. So if we take Ian's point, you will never be able to confirm until the data occurs. So you will always have 2, 3, 4, 10 economists that may differ. But the role you want to be able to do is to be able to project. And if we just think of climate, when I say the vulnerability has changed before and after an event, the state and evolution of climate change before an event and after an event are clearly different. You will not be able to observe the climate change impact after the event occurs, because then it's history, it's already occurred. But if you know and can model how climate is actually evolving, climate change is evolving, then in principle, you could say your resilience, your internal resilience capacity, which is a function of how the climate change dynamic is changing, means you can incorporate into that duration element of your IRC a movement in the change in the evolution of climate change. In other words, if you were to start with a 1.1 and you end up with a 2.8 or 1.8, the vulnerabilities are very different. But my ability to grow, to go beyond recovery, to move into the potential zone that you talk about, will depend very critically on whether I end up at 1.2 or whether I end up at 1.8. But if my vulnerability is based on 1.1, I clearly am not going to be able to capture that. And when we say forward-looking, we need to be able to incorporate, if climate were to change to now 1.6, what does that mean in terms of your ability to be resilient? And that is that forward-looking component that you need to be able to model to give you a sense of the duration that we are talking about. So data has that dimension as well. It's backward-looking always, but it's the forward-looking aspect that you need to be able to capture through modeling of what you're trying to do. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Thanks, President. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to respond to the data question, and then we're going to wrap up for our online audience. Of course.
The forgiveness of debt,
sorry, debt forgiveness. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Coming back to that. So, from a purely economist perspective, there's that question of moral hazard, right? And it's our usual abstraction of what human behavior is. So the worry, I think, in principle is, at least by economists, if one were to forgive debts, then what is the incentive for not accumulating debt again? So that'd be pure economics. Now, we know in reality it's not like that, because there's many different issues about fairness, those sort of things. One could ask the question, why are a lot of these countries in debt in the first place? And there you could go back as far to, colonial times as being part of the reason. So that's one issue. So, the roundabout way, I think, to get around it is to think about conditional forgiveness of debt here. Of course, that then brings the question of under what conditions? If we forgive a particular country's debt, what do they have to do in turn? What do they have to commit to? And that gets, of course, into other more complicated questions. So I think it's important questions, because clearly once these economies reach a certain debt level, it's just going to be very difficult to get back to anything that one could call resilience. So somehow one has to bring them down. So there has to be some sort of forgiveness to some extent. Should it be full forgiveness? How much? And then, of course, comes the issue, if you forgive, let's say, the debt in Grenada, if it's very high, what about other African countries that have high debt? So it's a complicated issue, much more complicated, I think. We as economists can kind of abstract from it, but it's an important question. I don't think the answer is clearly no or yes, but it's just complicated. It's something there has to be a lot of discussion on from economists and other people in the social science, policymakers, and all these sort of things. So I'm giving you a very academic answer, which is who knows.
Thanks, Professor. On that note, I'm going to wrap up. I think that we had a very, very good discussion. I want to thank the panelists for of course, I want to thank the audience, both here with us physically and the audience online as well. So thank you very much.